When we contrast the Eastern conception with the Western conception generally, we find there even some major disagreements. For example, when we look at the journeys to the underworld in the tradition of Western literature, for example, Dante traveling through hell, or in Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus goes down into hell, and in Virgil, Aeneas goes down. And when they do go down into the underworld, they find that they recognize all the people that they once knew when they were in the upper world above. The soul in the West generally carries the shape and form of the body with it, as well as the personality, into the afterlife. And this is what enables Dante to go through recognizing all the cardinals and popes that have been assigned, that he is assigned to the various levels of hell, because he knew them up above. And then, but then if we're to contrast that idea generally with the Eastern cosmologies, you would not recognize any of your friends in either of the heavens or hells, because they would have been reborn as either a deity or a demon. That is to say that the conception of the soul in the Far East generally agrees insofar as it is this totally impersonal unit. It is a monad, as some traditions call it, the jiva, that transmigrates from body to body, but in between incarnations on the earth, it takes up its abode, depending on the karma that the person has generated, in one of the various levels of the heavens, or as a god, or one of the various levels of the hells as a devil. And so you would not recognize any of the people that you knew if you were to travel to these worlds. So even there we have a totally different conception of the soul. If we say, well, the soul does survive the death of the body, none of the traditions seem to agree on just exactly what attributes it takes up between lifetimes. And so we have to be careful then, and I want to just follow this Meister Eckhart line that we don't know truly what the soul is. We know what the idea refers to, and it's the elementary idea, the archetype of the soul that we'll be looking at here and feeling our way into, but we won't pretend to know exactly what it is and say exactly what it is. And we want to cultivate this sense of inwardness and respect for the mystery of these concepts that absolutely defy our human rationality. Now I just wanted to, with that little prelude, that sort of cultural comparison, I want to now move into the life and work of Carl Jung and spend the rest of our time here discussing his relationship with Freud. And this is particularly instructive because Freud, even though he is the founder more or less of psychology, was a rationalist, and the bone of contention between the two of them was with respect to the existence of the occult, which Freud had no interest in whatsoever. Freud came out of a Jewish background, even though he was a lapsed Jew and had no interest in worshiping. He was a card-carrying atheist and maintained that position toward the end of his life. Nonetheless, his vision of the psyche can be mapped onto certain aspects of the Judaic tradition very well. Insofar as, for example, everybody I'm sure knows the basic the relationship of the ego to the id. I mean, if we just draw it, and we say the ego's relationship to the id, and the id is the ego is simply means I, it's Latin for I, and it simply means our relationship to reality. It's the reality function. The id is Freud's word for the instincts of the unconscious. Everything that is within us that is the sexual drive in particular is what he's referring to, but also all instincts. And but we can map this on very well to the conception of Yahweh and vis-a-vis the so-called nature gods of all of the other religions surrounding the Hebraic conception. These are very homologous structures. The ego strives to keep the id under control and in check, just as Yahweh will have no other gods before him and strives to keep the nature gods in check. The dragon slayer myth, Hillman will later say in his work that essentially what the ego is in the id is essentially the hero's relationship to the dragon. And of course, so there's a certain, as the tradition develops here from Freud to Hillman, there's a criticism of the basic presuppositions of psychology that slowly develop, and it begins to sort of deconstruct and pull itself apart. Right now it's in the process of disintegrating. Hillman's just pulling the whole system apart. And he says in The Dream in the Underworld, if we see archetypally, and Hillman develops this concept of seeing through concepts to the indwelling archetypes behind them, he believes that archetypes are behind every thought we utter, every emotion we feel. And you just have to see through, which is the term that he uses. And he sees through Freud's structure here, and he says this is the hero conquering, overmastering, and slaying the dragon. And Freudian psychology, as well as the tradition of Judaism, is based on this desire for control over nature, control over the psyche. And so it has nothing to do at all with the more Eastern idea of kind of submission to the macrocosmic rhythms of the cosmos. So Freud comes out of this Hebraic tradition, even while repudiating it. The devil goes out the front door and then comes in the back window, disguised in the concepts. So not only that, but Freud was raised in the city. He spent his entire life in Vienna, never really left it until toward the end when the Nazis came in and forced him to go out. Very much the spirit of the times was materialistic, pragmatic, atheistic, and he was very much a man of that time period, good bourgeois. Whereas Jung, on the other hand, as we'll see, was born and raised in the Swiss countryside. And as he says there, it always occurred to me, he says, that city people never seem to understand what it's like to live in the country. We know about ghosts and the occult and all these strange things. I grew up with them. I watched them happen and take place. And so he has a totally different attitude toward the occult, having come out of that environment. And of course his religious background is from the Protestant matrix, which has to do with an intensive analysis of line by line of looking at texts. And so you get this tradition in, if you look at, try to read a book by Freud, it's actually rather easy reading compared to Jung, where there are densely layered lines of footnotes and references. He's just studied all of these texts. It's the Protestant rejection of the ritual in favor of the Bible, which led to the whole tradition of biblical scholarship. That really was a Protestant creation, and his father was a Lutheran, or a Protestant, I think he was a Lutheran pastor, and he comes out of that tradition of just reading text. And as he's going along and discovering alchemy, for example, he's unearthing all these obscure alchemical texts that nobody's ever heard of, and he's just putting in line after line after line. So he's a lot harder to read than Freud, but richer and denser. So Jung was born in 1875, and Freud was born in 1856. They were 19 years apart. That would be Uranus squared Uranus on Freud's chart.
That's good. Yeah.
And Uranus, the Jungian astrologer, just as a footnote, the Jungian astrologer Richard Tarnas has written a whole monograph on Uranus discussing how Uranus is associated with rebellion and the archetype of the rebel. And so that Uranus square Uranus plays itself out in the one Freud rebelling against the whole tradition of medicine, and Jung rebelling against Freud. The rebel archetype we'll see playing itself out in their relationship. And Jung was born a Leo, and Freud was born a Taurus. And that also will have a lot to do with the archetypes that we'll see playing themselves out.
And repressed sexuality coming from a Taurus. Is this not like,
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. Yes.
The defense rests.
Okay. So we have that just for starters, so you can carry that in your mind as we go through the story. That difference between their personalities. Oh, also on the birth charts, which I have a copy of here, but I didn't photocopy both of their birth charts. They have Jung's moon is conjunct within 1 degree Freud's sun at 15-16 degrees Taurus. So they have this unconscious, conscious, it's almost like chemical affinity. They're just matched and ready to go right from the start with this archetypal male-female polarity going right down the line. And I'll bring the transparency of the birth chart next time so that we can play with that. So Freud is working as a neurologist, and psychology is generally said to begin with the publication in 1895 of his work with Joseph Breuer, who was his mentor at the time, Studies in Hysteria. And the concluding chapter of that, which Freud himself wrote, is generally regarded as marking the beginning of psychoanalysis.